Imagine you're standing on the walls of Constantinople. The year is 1453. You hear the thunder, but it's not the sky that's roaring. It's cannon fire. Smoke fills the air, the earth shakes, and before your eyes, the greatest city in Christendom, a city that had survived for over 1,000 years, begins to crumble. And at the center of that storm is a 21-year-old Sultan, Mehmed II. He's young, brilliant, ruthless, and he's about to change history forever. For centuries, Constantinople was the ultimate fortress, a wall between East and West, between Islam and Christendom, between medieval faith and the dawn of modern power. But on that day, May 29, 1453, the impossible happens. The city falls. The Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of Rome, is gone, and suddenly, the map of the world is rewritten. Europe wakes up to a nightmare. The Ottomans aren't just another empire. They're a machine, an empire built on discipline, innovation, and faith. Their armies move with a speed and precision that make medieval kings look like amateurs. At the heart of their power stands the Janissary Corps, elite soldiers taken as boys from Christian families, raised to serve the Sultan with absolute loyalty. They are modern in a way no one else in Europe yet understands, trained, drilled, paid, and deadly efficient. And behind them, a state that doesn't just fight wars, it manufactures them. The Ottoman system is like something out of science fiction for the 15th century. Their bureaucracy, their logistics, their tax system, everything is engineered for one purpose: expansion. And from the ashes of Constantinople, they begin to look westward. Hungary, the Balkans, Vienna, they call Europe the land of war, and every Christian ruler knows they could be next. But let's be honest, Europe in the 15th century isn't ready for this. It's divided, torn by greed, religion, and ego. France and England are still bleeding from the 100 Years' War. Italy is busy stabbing itself with city-state rivalries. The Holy Roman Empire is more holy than organized. It's chaos, and in that chaos, the Ottoman storm keeps growing. Picture this: Ottoman fleets on the Adriatic, Ottoman armies crossing the Danube, Ottoman banners rising over Serbia, Bosnia, and Greece. Each victory sends a message: the old world is dying and a new order is coming. Europe is terrified, and yet paralyzed. The papacy calls for crusades, but who answers? Kings make speeches about defending Christendom, then go back to arguing over trade and succession. Only a few stubborn voices cry out, "If we don't stand together, we will fall one by one." But who listens to prophets when gold and glory still blind the courts of Europe? And then, something begins to shift. A few men, soldiers, priests, even merchants, begin to understand that this isn't just a military problem. It's a civilizational one. If Europe is to survive, it must change how it thinks, how it fights, how it unites. So they begin to study the Ottomans. How do they move their armies so fast? How do they manage their supply lines? How do they hold together such a vast empire of different languages and faiths? They start to see a terrifying truth: the Ottomans are not barbarians. They're efficient. And that's what makes them unstoppable. Meanwhile, in the cities of Italy, scholars and thinkers, men like Machiavelli, are watching the world transform. They start to ask questions no one dared ask before. What makes power? What keeps it? How do you defend against an empire that believes God is on its side? And somewhere between the parchment and the canon, Europe begins to rediscover something ancient: strategy. Because the Ottomans don't just bring war, they bring a mirror. A reflection of everything Europe fears and secretly envies. Now imagine you're a Venetian merchant in the late 1400s. Your ships once ruled the Mediterranean, carrying silk, spices, and gold. But now, Ottoman galleys patrol the same waters. You see their flags in the distance, the crescent moon, and you know trade has a new master. Venice can't fight them head-on, so it does what Venice always does. It adapts. It trades with them. It spies on them. It learns from them. Venetian engineers start redesigning fortresses to withstand Ottoman cannons. Italian shipwrights begin copying Ottoman hull designs. And slowly, the seeds of resistance begin to grow, not through faith alone, but through intelligence. Let's pause and ask something Dan Carlin would ask. What would it feel like to live in that world? To be a peasant in Hungary, hearing stories of Ottoman raiders burning villages just beyond the hills. Or a monk in Rome praying that the next army to march north isn't marching for the Pope. Fear becomes the great teacher, and fear forces innovation. Europe begins building walls thicker, guns bigger, alliances broader. The knights, symbols of the old world, start to fade, replaced by professional armies. The battlefield becomes a laboratory, and slowly, painfully, a new kind of warfare begins to emerge. Gunpowder changes everything. Once the Ottomans dominated through cannons, now Europe starts to learn the same lesson. If you can't stop the storm, you learn to ride it. But even as new defenses rise, there's another battle being fought, not on the ground, but in the soul of Europe. Because the Ottoman advance forces a question that will haunt kings and philosophers alike. If they are so disciplined, so organized, so victorious, why aren't we? It's the kind of existential crisis that pushes civilizations to evolve. And out of that pressure comes something unexpected: unity, even if temporary. Hungary, Poland, Austria. They begin to realize that survival depends on cooperation. The phrase, defender of Christendom, starts to mean something again. And though most crusades fail, each defeat becomes a lesson. Each loss becomes a blueprint for something better. By the end of the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire stretches across 3 continents. They control trade routes, choke cities, and hold the Holy Land. But Europe is changing. Printing presses are spreading ideas faster than swords ever could. Explorers are discovering new worlds. And behind the walls of cathedrals and castles, thinkers are studying war, governance, and faith with a new kind of realism. They no longer see defense as a matter of prayer, but of planning. The storm still rages. But for the first time, Europe is learning how to read the wind. And that's where our story truly begins. Because the question that will define the next century isn't just how do you fight the Ottomans. It's how do you survive them long enough to become something greater. In the next chapter, Europe's transformation begins. From fear to resilience, from defense to defiance. Walls will rise, alliances will fracture, and kings will gamble everything to hold back the crescent tide. This is how a continent learns to fight for its soul. The year is 1529. The world has changed, but the storm has not passed. In fact, it's grown stronger. The Ottoman war machine is marching again, and this time it's heading straight for the heart of Europe. Vienna. A city that stands like a stone shield between the East and the West. Imagine it a sea of tents stretching beyond the horizon. Hundreds of thousands of men. Cannon barrels glinting in the morning sun. At their head, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, a ruler at the peak of power, and before him, the trembling walls of Vienna, defended by a handful of soldiers, farmers, and priests. The odds, impossible. But that's the thing about history, it doesn't care about odds. Let's step back for a moment. How did it come to this? How did Europe, the continent that once sent crusaders eastward, end up fighting for its own survival? The truth is, Europe had to learn the hard way. Every battle lost to the Ottomans was a page in a manual of survival. Every fortress that fell became a lesson written in blood. Europe didn't just need courage. It needed strategy. Take the fortress of Belgrade. In 1456, the Ottomans came for it with everything they had: cannons, janissaries, siege towers. But this time, something different happened. A Hungarian general, John Hunyadi, did what few dared. He studied his enemy. He learned how the Ottoman army moved, how they positioned their artillery, how they relied on timing and intimidation. And then, he flipped the script. Instead of waiting behind walls, Hunyadi struck first. He raided their camps, burned their supplies, and attacked when they least expected it. During prayer, when the smoke cleared, the mighty Ottoman army was retreating. Belgrade had survived, and for the first time in decades, Europe had hope. That victory didn't stop the Ottomans, but it taught Europe something critical. Fortresses alone couldn't save them. They had to fight intelligently. So across the continent, engineers and generals began to think differently. In Italy, they developed a new kind of fortification, the Tres Italienne, or Star Fort. Low, angled walls that could deflect cannonballs and expose attackers to crossfire. Gone were the tall medieval towers that crumbled under artillery. In their place, sharp geometry and science. It wasn't just architecture, it was evolution. The Ottomans had revolutionized siege warfare. Now Europe was revolutionizing defense itself. And soon, cities like Vienna, Budapest, and Dubrovnik became laboratories of survival. But walls could only hold as long as the people inside believed in them. And that's where things got complicated. Because Europe, as always, was divided. Catholics and Protestants tearing each other apart in wars of religion. Kings and popes more interested in each other's crowns than in the rising crescent on the horizon. While Suleiman's armies marched west, Christian rulers fought each other. France even allied with the Ottomans at one point. Yes, the so-called most Christian king, Francis I, shaking hands with the Sultan to undermine his rivals. That's politics for you, brutal, pragmatic, short-sighted. And every time Europe turned its swords inward, the Ottomans pressed forward. Still, something fascinating was happening beneath the chaos. Knowledge was spreading. Maps, gun designs, military treatises, all crossing borders faster than any army could march. The printing press was doing what no pope, no emperor, no crusade could ever do: unite Europe in information. A German blacksmith could read about Venetian naval tactics. A French general could study the fortresses of Rhodes. Ideas became weapons, and strategy became survival. Now, picture this moment: the Siege of Rhodes, 1522. The Knights Hospitaller, a few thousand men, facing 100,000 Ottoman troops. They knew they couldn't win. But they also knew something far more powerful: they could delay. For 6 long months, they fought like ghosts. Every alleyway a trap, every wall a final stand. They built underground tunnels to sabotage Ottoman mines. They rigged their own city to collapse sections at will, denying the enemy safe ground. When they finally surrendered, even the Sultan admired them. He let them leave alive, warriors respecting warriors. And in that bloody lesson, Europe found something it had forgotten: honor in resistance. But let's step into the mind of a European king for a second. Imagine you're Ferdinand of Austria or Sigismund of Poland. You know the Ottomans can summon armies twice your size. You can't outmatch them in manpower. So how do you win? You don't. You endure. You fight wars not to conquer, but to buy time. Time for your allies to respond. Time for the weather to turn. Time for your people to adapt. The defense of Vienna in 1529 is the perfect example of this philosophy. When Suleiman's forces reached the city, the defenders, barely 20,000 strong, faced an army of over 100,000. But they had one advantage: preparation. They flooded fields to slow the Ottomans' cannons. They dug trenches, built makeshift walls, and used the ruins as cover. Every citizen became a soldier. Even women and children carried ammunition and poured boiling tar from rooftops. For weeks, Vienna burned, but did not fall. And when the rains came, the Ottoman siege faltered. Mud swallowed their artillery. Disease spread, and the great army of the East, unstoppable until then, began to retreat. The world watched in disbelief. Europe had survived again. It's easy, centuries later, to underestimate how close they came to annihilation. If Vienna had fallen, the road to Germany, and possibly France, would have been wide open. There might not have been a Reformation or a Renaissance as we know it. Europe might have become just another province in a vast Ottoman world. But history, that unpredictable, merciless teacher, gave them just enough victories to keep fighting, and those victories transformed them. Europe began to realize that defending against the Ottomans wasn't just about soldiers and walls. It was about systems. The Ottomans had supply lines, logistics, centralized command. Europe had to match that, and eventually, it did. Kings started to build standing armies. Professional, disciplined, paid soldiers rather than feudal levies. Bureaucracies formed to collect taxes and fund fortresses year-round. Trade routes were fortified, communication lines secured. And slowly, the battlefield shifted. No longer just fortresses under siege, but empires learning from each other, adapting, absorbing, evolving. And that's what makes this story so fascinating. The defense against the Ottomans didn't just preserve Europe. It changed it. It forced a continent stuck in medieval thinking to enter the modern age. Gunpowder, maps, naval power, diplomacy, all born out of fear of the crescent flag. Even the concept of balance of power, that delicate dance between nations, has its roots here. Because when facing a giant, the only way to survive is to make sure no one power, not even your friend, becomes too strong. The Ottomans forced Europe to learn that lesson, and it stuck. But let's not romanticize it. The wars were brutal. Entire regions, Hungary, the Balkans, became graveyards of empire. Cities changed hands over and over. Peasants were enslaved, villages burned, children taken to feed the Janissary corpse. It wasn't a story of clean heroism, it was a story of endurance, of learning to live on the edge of destruction. And in that struggle, something strange happened: admiration. Many European generals privately respected the Ottoman system, its discipline, its order, its meritocracy. In a Europe plagued by corruption and nepotism, that kind of efficiency was terrifyingly attractive. It's the irony of history sometimes. Your enemy becomes your teacher. So by the mid-1500s, Europe stands battered, divided, but wiser. The Ottoman Empire still looms large. But the tide is beginning to shift. New powers, Spain, Portugal, and eventually England, are looking beyond the Mediterranean toward the oceans. They're realizing that maybe the way to survive the Ottoman chokehold on land is to go around it by sea. The age of exploration and of global empires is about to begin. But the lessons learned from defending against the Ottomans will echo for centuries. In strategy, in politics, even in identity. Because every empire needs an enemy to define itself against. And for Europe, the Ottoman Empire was that mirror, vast, relentless, and brilliant. So when you hear of Vienna, of Rhodes, of Malta, remember, these weren't just battles. They were the crucible in which Europe was forged. In our final chapter, we'll see how the West turns defense into dominance. How the very strategies used to survive the Ottoman storm become the blueprint for empire itself. But before that happens, one question still lingers. When does survival turn into ambition? Imagine the map of the 16th century, the world trembling under the shadow of the crescent moon. The Ottomans ruled an empire stretching from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the Black Sea to the Nile. They seemed unstoppable, the masters of war, wealth, and willpower. And yet cracks were beginning to show. No empire falls in a single day. It erodes, slowly, quietly, from the inside out. And Europe, for all its chaos and division, was learning how to push back. Let's rewind to a battlefield. Malta, 1565. A tiny island fortress standing against one of the largest invasions in Mediterranean history. The defenders. A few hundred knights of St. John, the remnants of the Hospitallers who had once held Rhodes. The attackers. The full might of the Ottoman navy, commanded by one of the most feared admirals in history, Dragut. The siege lasted 4 brutal months. Cannon fire shattered walls, disease tore through both camps, and the sea ran red with blood. But the defenders refused to yield. When the smoke cleared, Malta still stood. The knights had survived the storm, and the world took notice. Europe realized something profound. The Ottomans could be stopped. From that moment, the psychology of power shifted. For a century, Europe had lived in fear of Ottoman expansion. Now, that fear began to turn into resolve. But how do you defeat an empire built on discipline and innovation? You evolve faster. You think bigger. That's exactly what Europe did. Gunpowder warfare, once the Ottomans' greatest weapon, was no longer their exclusive edge. By the late 1500s, European cannon foundries, especially in Austria, Venice, and Spain, were producing artillery that matched, even surpassed Ottoman technology. Naval warfare was changing too. The Mediterranean was no longer just the Sultan's sea, and then came the turning point. Lepanto, 1571. The Battle of Lepanto wasn't just another naval clash, it was the clash. A Christian coalition, Spain, Venice, the Papal States, formed a fleet to face the Ottoman navy head-on. For hours, cannon thunder echoed across the sea. Oars snapped, ships burned. Men screamed in languages from across continents. When it was over, the Ottoman fleet was shattered. Thousands of their best sailors dead, the myth of invincibility gone. Europe celebrated not just a victory, but a psychological liberation. After more than a century of fear, they could finally breathe. Now, did this mean the Ottoman Empire was finished? No, not even close. They remained powerful, organized, and culturally vibrant. But momentum, that invisible force that drives history, had shifted. The energy of conquest was now flowing westward. The Ottomans were still looking inward, defending vast borders, maintaining bureaucracy, and preserving control. Europe, meanwhile, was looking outward, across oceans. The defensive lessons learned from centuries of Ottoman wars were now being repurposed for something else: expansion. Think about it. The same logistical planning that once fortified Vienna was now fueling voyages across the Atlantic. The same artillery technology designed to defend against sieges was now mounted on ships sailing to conquer the New World. The same diplomacy used to unite Christian kings against the Turks was now being used to divide and dominate continents. In a strange, ironic way, the Ottomans had prepared Europe to rule the world. But this new world came at a price. Because while Europe rose, the Ottoman Empire began to stagnate. The same structure that made it powerful, the centralized system, the elite janissaries, the Sultan's absolute control, became its weakness. Bureaucracy turned rigid, innovation slowed, and the world outside was moving faster than ever. Europe was no longer defending. It was industrializing, colonizing, globalizing. The Ottomans, for the first time, were reacting instead of leading. Still, it would be a mistake to think of them as passive victims of history. They endured for centuries. Even in decline, the Ottomans remained one of the longest, lasting empires in human history. Their influence shaped architecture, cuisine, language, and law across 3 continents. But the spark that once terrified Europe was fading. Let's pause for a moment and ask, what does it mean to defend yourself for centuries? To live generation after generation, measuring your success not by victory, but by survival. Europe's greatest achievement wasn't just in defeating the Ottomans. It was in transforming itself through that struggle. The pressure forged resilience, the fear built cooperation, the conflict created identity. Without the Ottoman threat, there might never have been a Renaissance, a Reformation, or the rise of modern states. It was the enemy at the gates that forced Europe to grow up. Now picture the 17th century. The once mighty Ottoman armies standing at the gates of Vienna again in 1683. But this time, something's different. Europe isn't trembling anymore. It's waiting. King Jan Sobieski of Poland arrives with a cavalry charge so massive it will echo through history. The winged hussars. Their lances break the Ottoman lines like a thunderclap. The siege collapses. The empire retreats. And never again would it reach that far west. That day, September 12, 1683, marked not just the defeat of an army, but the end of an era. The age of Ottoman expansion was over, and the age of European dominance had begun. But history, as always, is not about good guys and bad guys. It's about transformation. It's about what humanity learns from conflict. The Ottomans showed the world that unity, discipline, and innovation could build an empire that lasted 600 years. Europe showed that fear, when faced head-on, could be turned into progress. And together, in war, in trade, in culture, they shaped the modern world. The walls of Vienna, the harbors of Venice, the mosques of Istanbul. They all tell the same story, two civilizations staring at each other across centuries, neither fully destroying the other, but both forever changed by the encounter. So the question remains, was it victory or transformation? Did Europe defeat the Ottomans, or did the Ottomans forge Europe? Maybe both. Because history is rarely about who wins, it's about who evolves. And the struggle between cross and crescent forced both sides to evolve. Militarily, politically, and spiritually. It's a story of endurance, ingenuity, and identity. So when we ask, how did Europe defend itself against the Ottomans? The real answer isn't found in cannons or castles. It's found in ideas, in adaptation, in learning from your enemy until you no longer fear them. Because defense, in the end, is just another form of survival. And survival is the seed of civilization. For centuries, Europe stood in the shadow of the Ottoman Empire. And from that shadow, it built the modern world. This is Unresolved History. Subscribe to uncover how fear forged empires and how power reshaped humanity.